Thank you so much, Rehan, for joining us on this podcast at Dawdle, and extremely happy that you took out time, to kind of share your insights with our global audience. We've got very interesting set of topics and very, kind of different viewpoints on topics, to have, that we want to take it from Rehan. But before we go there, I would like to introduce him formally to our audience. Rehan is a seasoned cloud and infrastructure transformation leader with over 15 years of experience across global technology organizations. Currently, he's a lead ITO and cloud solution capabilities at DXC Technology, where he drives large scale cloud, managed services, and outsourcing solutions, aligning technology strategy with business outcomes. With prior leadership roles at Coforge and Accenture, he has built and scaled cloud practices across AWS, GCP, and hybrid environments, leading pre-sales, solution architecture, and complex transformation programs across APAC geography. He's known for his expertise in RFP-driven solutioning and strategic insourcing. He has consistently delivered value-driven, scalable, and cost-optimized enterprise solutions. Thank you so much, Rehan. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good to be here.
Rehan, cloud everywhere. So the first question is related to that. So, you have seen multiple cloud transport, transformations end to end. At a strategic level, what do you think organization misunderstand about cloud, or are they solving a wrong problem from the start?
Well, the strategy and the associated pitfalls has evolved as the cloud has evolved over the last 10 years or so, right? So one of the earliest sort of memory that I have is, when I was working with a particular client, after the cloud migration had done, they were expected some reduction in the cloud spend, and that didn't happen. It was up by about 20-25%, right? And obviously they were not very happy about it. So that was one of the initial things that and we experienced that across many clients, right? Over a period when I was, especially at Coforge, right? So when we spoke to the client, that was when just below COVID or before COVID, people started moving to cloud in large masses. So we used to tell them, it was a very difficult conversation. We used to tell them that, look, if you migrate to cloud and you're thinking cloud as another data center where I'm just going to move all of my workloads, that's not going to result in cost reduction, right? That tendency is still there, and it's a very difficult conversation. Mostly whenever we discuss with an organization and trying to shape the way they adopt the cloud, and this is a problem which now I would say all of them are facing, right? Because they had this expectation, it will not meet, right, unless you make large scale changes. Right? Part of the problem there is, because most of these IT organizations, they are second gen, third gen, or even first gen in some cases, sources, they don't understand how do you sort of evolve your capabilities, right? So they treat cloud migration like a project. So I'm going to literally wave a Harry Potter wand, and then suddenly all my problems goes away. My cost goes down by 20%, and my agility goes up by 30%. My MTTR reduces. So they think of it like a magic wand, which is not how it works, right, obviously. And this is where I think when I discuss this with many organizations, we talk about, look, the moving to the cloud part is the easy part, right? At the end of the day, that is a place where you host your app. You can keep this in your data center. You keep it in some other places. You could put it in cloud, but unless you leverage the capabilities that cloud is giving and make some changes in the way you operate, it's not going to result in any benefit per se, right? Except, and the key benefit at one point was that because you had the OPEX versus CAPEX discussion about 8 years ago, 7 years ago, a lot of clients took benefit of that, especially pre-COVID. Right? But nowadays, the cost aspect of what you do in the centers versus what you do in cloud is minimal, right? So it comes down to the capabilities. So most of these discussions that we have with the client, and we try to help them reorganize the way they operate, right? So what that means is you have to stop thinking of cloud as a data center somewhere I host my app. You just move things as you wish, right? Rather, you have to think of it as a programmable infrastructure and then build foundations around that. Right? So once you start building the foundations there, you start using the features and the automations that cloud gives. You can start leveraging it correctly. So for example, something as simple as how do I automate my DR, right? It's a tough question that most clients ask. The features are there, right? We have done this for probably 50 or 100 clients. I have myself done it for probably 10, 15 clients, right? The features are there, the capabilities are there. It's just that the way you have built your application, you can't migrate it as is to the cloud and then expect it to work like you want, right? So you have to make certain changes. You have to make some hard decisions, and then that's what will drive the value that the cloud provides, if that makes sense. Right? So that's one of the key pitfalls that I always see, right? It's going to be some magic cost reduction. Is going to be some suddenly I'm going to get better. You're not going to get better, right? So you have to invest in capability. You have to invest in skills. You have to change the way you operate and go through a proper change management process to be able to get there.
And that is where I think most of the organization ignored this thing. And also there are a lot of cloud optimization tools also coming up now. Rehan, would you like to throw some light on them? Like, are they really doing something good, or it's kind of a farce?
No, it's not farce. It's definitely not farce. There is benefit to be had there. But having said that, again, another pitfall or shortcut that people tend to think is when I'm going to bring in this fancy tool and suddenly my organization is going to be 5-star in my FinOps process. That's not going to happen again, right? So you can buy as many tools as you want to be able to leverage those tools and then bring out the right outcomes from there. Requires discipline, requires again focused effort, right? So there are many good tools in the market at this point. IPM has a couple of them, Cloudability and others. There are many others that are available, right? The features are more or less the same. All of them will give you the ability to basically track your costs and then be able to do chargeback and showbacks to your business units, and also then generate generate insights into what is it that I can do better. Broadly, this is more what all of those tools do, right? But to be able to get there, you need to have certain rigor in the environment, right? So if you, for example, just done a project where you're even tracking which workload is being used by which BU, how are you going to go back and tell those BUs that, look, are you really using it, right? That reminds me, one of the funny things that we do with that I've met with many organizations is we suddenly shut down something, right? The industry term that is scream test. So we shut down something and somebody comes screaming saying that, why have you shut down my application, right? Believe it or not, if I shut down 100 of them, we only get 90 people shouting at us. There are 10 that are about 10 that are completely not being used. Nobody cares. Nobody knows what's doing, right? So you have to solve basic things first before you bring in a tool and then use that tool to drive the future benefits that you can drive in your environment.
This was really insightful. This is scream test. ये वाला जो टेस्ट है scream test, ये आपने word बनाया या फिर it's already there in the industry?
No, it is not steam. It is scream, as in shouting. Right?
Yes, scream test.
So it's like you shut something down, right? कहीं पे किसी का लंका डूबने लगा, and they will come back and say, oh, you know what? Why is it not working? I mean, again, not trying to make it as a joke, right? But see, typically what will happen is in any environment we will know about 70 to 80% what is it, what is happening, right? There are always those 30% which nobody knows what is it doing, what applications are being running, who owns it, is it even being used? So generally, and again, depends on the timelines and a lot of other factors, right? But let's say a large enough organization which has a couple of thousand workloads on cloud, they're going to go through a gradual process of moving to cloud, right? So we try and do these kind of things. See, again, we will not shut it down and get rid of it, right? So we'll shut it down and wait for some time and even keep backups in cases to see if that is really needed, right? A lot of time we don't even shut it down. We'll just disable the network, right? So nobody's able to access it. And that way, as I said, in the 10% that we will do this or 20% that we will do, a lot of time people will not even come back and tell us, right? And we'll keep those running for a while and then eventually decommission them with the proper procedure and the processes, right? But it does happen. It does happen. Any project that we have done, I would say out of 100, 10% is just there, which nobody's using because in data center, nobody's tracking them. But one of the things that we do is when you move to cloud, the traceability has to be there. You have to even use policy as code to enforce the tagging standards and make sure everything is being tracked and then tied back to one of the business units or whomsoever the stakeholders are.
Now, Rehan, you have also worked on a lot of RFPs. Like, so when you design a large cloud deal, especially through RFPs, what are the complexities that never show up in proposals but become critical during it? Or,
See, the RFPs are almost like a very controlled environment, right? So there are 2-3 aspects to this, right? So the key one is because RFP is a very controlled environment because the organization is trying to evaluate the partners that they're working with. So they have to normalize those partners, right? And in turn, what that means is they have to normalize their ask, and then they have to normalize the responses that they're getting. So a lot of times, one of the key things that happens is the scope that is identified is usually not exhaustive, right? For a variety of reasons, which dives into the second or third aspect, which is a lot of time these RFPs, depending upon who's running them and who has originating them within the organization, may or may not have the right level of executive sponsorship, right? It depends on the size, right? But the part of the problem is when you don't have the right level of even the executive sponsorship is, as I would say, probably one of the pillars, right? Even if you have those sponsorship, right? because in most organizations you'll have multiple business units, the alignment might not be there, right? So there will be one business unit start sitting somewhere else. They'll say, "Oh, you know what? I don't want to do it. I'm very happy with the way this is going," and they will come up with valid reasons. And I'm not saying they're invalid, but they will come with valid reasons saying that this is why I need this to be there as it is, right? So a lot of times this is one of the key things that happens, right? And what that means is in a RFP, if I provide a solution which is aligned to what we have has been asked, right? Very well aware that this is not going to be everything. There's bound to be more, and then those discussions needs to be had. But the key problem that happens is, again, RFPs are RFPs, right? We always know what those things that we need to do. We always will have a standardized way of building a solution for them, and customizing them as they need. And then there will be a very standardized way of evaluating whether the solution is um, you know fit for them or not, right? Both by them and by us and by third parties. But once we get into the execution, the first point of problem that arises is, oh, you know what, you didn't think about this, right? And that happens because you can't, for example, in an RFP stage, you don't know what are the different legacy systems in there, right? So, for example, in old systems, what you'll find is there is one database sitting somewhere, which there is an ETL job running, and then that is being used by somewhere in a very niche manner. But if you break that ETL job, it will break the entire workflow. And nobody knows who has created that. It's just there. It's syncing from some other database, right? So you build those kind of workflows which are undocumented. Nobody's maintaining them, just working. And old workflows, a lot of these workflows are very stable, right? But because you don't know what those are, you end up in a situation where you don't know what to do with them. And that's one of the big problems, right? Which is the unknowns in the environments, if they are not documented, especially if you don't have a proper, let's say, again, first, second gen outsourcers, they don't have very mature CMDB and very mature processes to track what they have in their, the assets that they have in their data centers, right? So a lot of times when we go and deploy our discovery tools, we will figure out, oh, you know what, they said I have 1,500 workloads, but I'm getting about 1,800 or 2,000. So there's going to be these kind of issues, right? Not that there is a problem with the scope and disagreement in scope. Most clients understand this, most organizations understand them, and most of the partners will understand them. But what this results is then timelines, right? Because doing a migration of, let's say, 1,500 workload versus another 500 workloads, which are undocumented, we don't know what surprises are there. They're two different things. And because of those timelines, there will be project and cost overruns, and there will be objective overruns,
Yes.
which is where managing the expectation becomes a bit of a problem, right? So this is the key thing, right? Once you understand the unknowns, after that, it is about, as I said, org alignment. If the organization is aligned, there's an executive sponsorship coming from top that yes, this is something strategic and we have to do it, it will result in positive results eventually, right? Because you're going to get support from the different people that we're working with. If there is no alignment, then it's almost like flying at night without radar, right?
Yes.
Becomes very difficult and increases the risk and the failure rates in this case.
No, this is very insightful. So one thing is that what you told is that whenever we are kind of doing the RFPs, we need to be clear about what are those unknowns. And for that to happen, it's also very important to have proper discussion with the teams as well, because unless or until we understand their as is process, it's kind of pretty difficult to identify those unknowns. But we see most of the companies are kind of rushing to fill in the RFP. So your viewpoints on that?
Yeah, see, during the RFP stage, you can't figure this out. So because, as I said, it's a very controlled environment. The data that you're going to get is very controlled, and they have to be standardized in a particular way that will consume. Right? The whole process is very um, almost like there is point A to point B. We know what needs to be there, right? And there are going to be lines drawn across, right? And both parties understand this, the organizations as well as the partners. So when an RFP comes to us, we will work with those constraints, and we will create solutions which are tied to the letter or of the requirements, right? Even though we will know better, right? But again, we have to be a bit careful because let's say, if I start coloring outside the lines and the organization procurement is running this RFP, they will just do a, numbering 1 to 3 and
Yes.
then kick people out, right? So we don't want that. Hence, what we typically do is we will answer the exam question, and then we will put the necessary caveats in there saying, look, these are the areas that we know from our experience, we have to delve deeper. And we will do that once we have a better, more chance to talk to each other. right? So which is why the RFP response part is very sort of, I would say, in a project end to end, it's a very small part of it, right? Once the down selection has been done, once you start getting a chance to go in front of the client, defend your solutions, take the feedback in, and then come back, right? That is when all of this, smaller things will, or large, rather unknowns will start getting added. And even after that, you can't cover all the eventualities, right? But again, because we have done, for example, I've done like 400 of these, right? So we know what are the things that are going to go wrong, and we will try to caveat them in upfront with full transparency with the organization and the client that we are working with. These are the things that we know can go wrong, and we'll build a mitigation plan on how to solve them if we get into those kind of scenarios.
Rehan, I was just thinking that there are a lot of tools that have also come out which are helping organizations fill in the RFPs, and they kind of give a lot of insights. If you have a few insights around that, if you want to throw light on.
So I guess this is one of the areas where AI is going to play a big role in and at some point, right? There has always been tools which would try and look at your RFP and come back with an answer, right? So again, there are 2-3 parts to this, right? There is the part about when you're responding to RFP, there are usually going to be 3 parts to it, right? There's a part about demonstrating my capabilities. There's a part about explaining my solution, and there's going to be part about the economics of the solution. Broadly speaking, these are the 3 things, right? So there has always been tools for the first part and the second part. The third part has been the first part, which is the capability, demonstration of capability, and the second part, the third part, which is the economics of the solution, right? Both of them are more or less science. So for example, and you can ask this to any other solution architect who's been for a while, right? So I can, with a reasonable degree of accuracy, guess what an Accenture or what a TCS is going to come back with, right? And similarly, others will do, right? So we will all have market intelligence based upon third parties, and we will leverage that to make sure that what we are giving to a client is not way off, right? So for example, I don't say, let's say Mount Everest if they're asking for something else, right? From an Nainital. I don't quote for a Rolls Royce if they're asking for an ambassador.
Yes.
So we will try to do all of these things. But the middle part, which is the story of my solution, that has largely been a sort of an art form, right? But with the LLMs, this is also becoming more and more automated, right? Now the interesting part about this is this, right? Which is the RFPs themselves are being generated using AI and LLMs.
Yes.
Responses are being evaluated using this AI and LLMs. So you have a literally like a work cycle where the origination is using LLMs, the response is partially LLM, not fully. The evaluation is LLMs, and then it will spit out answers, which will then be given to the vendors, who will again use LLMs to modify their workflow, right? So, I mean, in my mind, there's going to be at one point there's going to be a situation where this is going to be LLMs talking to each other, but it's probably 5 years in or 10 years in the future. So that's nothing to be.
Rihan, in your experience, how often do architectural decisions get driven by business economics versus technical analysis?
Depends on the size and the risk appetite of the company. But if I were to take, for example, most enterprises, the decisions are almost always driven by budgets and economics. That's the hard reality of it, right? Because most of these enterprises have to do business, which means they're publicly listed, by the way, right? Most of them, except for, let's say, out of Fortune 500 fund, probably I don't know, 50 maybe not publicly listed, but most of them are. So what that means is, they make forward-looking commitments to the public, and then they flow down as a budget to each one of these departments. So for example, the IT department will have, or the CIO will have a certain budget, and then he has to do things within those budgets. A lot of time we will come with a very elegant solution, which they will deem as not being cost effective. So then we have to make compromises, and we have to give them a solution which is economical within their budget, but also we'll try to do as much mapping as possible in terms of where the target state is, but it's going to be a compromise somewhere in the middle. That's the hard reality of it. So almost always it is driven by the budgetary and the economics of the solution. But then, having said that, there are hard lines, right? So for example, if I need certain level of resiliency, if I need, let's say, 15 minutes of RPO, I'm going to have to have 15 minutes of RPO regardless of what it costs. Similarly, if I need to take the example of HDFC Bank in India, right? Or for that matter, any other bank in India, right? Your net banking has to be up for a certain period of time. It doesn't matter. If it's not up for that level of time, you get fined by the government.
Yes.
So in those cases, if the budget is not calculated correctly, we will help them do that, right? But the solution is going to be something which is compliant to the industry. So the only times when these architectural decisions will override budgetary concerns is when there is a compliance or a regulatory compliance or a security compliance that we need to meet. Right. And again, there are different options, there are different ways of doing things. There will be hard lines that look, it has to be done this way. There is no other way, right? Because we will not do something which is not regulatory compliant and which results in some kind of a violation or something. So we'll help the clients to and the organization that we're working with to get to that level as well.
And I think the next one we have already touched upon in the first 5 minutes is that cloud is often positioned as a cost saving layer. Yet many enterprises see cost spiral. Would you like to touch upon the structural reasons behind it and what should organization do differently?
See, a lot of there are many reasons for why that happens. Right? I'm going to give you an example, and this is one of my earliest examples. Right? This was a um, I don't want to name the client, but this was a pretty significant size company, global company that we were working with. And they had decided that I'm going to move everything to cloud. And I was part of the project team, and we did all the assessment. We did all the, did the RFP. We went through the process, did presentations. We showed them the business case. All of that was great, right? On day one, we managed to meet target because they were quite flexible about, as I said, using a mechanism and changing the way they operated, right? So they let us do that. This was a very mature client. They understood what they're doing, right? But even after that, 6 months down the line, they were overrunning the costs, right? So what causes that? There are several factors, right? So the first and the foremost is, as I said, if you were to just take all of the workloads that you have today and move it to some other place, you're just changing the place that you're renting to keep your workloads, right? And that usually will not result in a cost reduction. In fact, more often than not, and we are seeing this in the market today, right? Where more often than not, the hardware has become, let me take that back a bit, right? With the RAM problem going on, it again has been, is going to and fro. Yes. For the last 2 or 3 years, hardware has become so cheap that for many clients, it's actually cheaper to run it in the data centers rather than on cloud. Yes. I've worked with many such organizations where we've helped them bring a lot of these workloads back to the data center, or even adopt a hybrid cloud architecture, right, where they run in best of the both worlds, because both will give you different sort of features and the flexibility. So we try to do that. But part of the reason is that, right? So which is when you move to cloud, do you adopt the cloud native way of working, right? Which means I will have a method to shut down my non-production environment, right? When nobody's working on it, right? One of the common things that we have seen is many clients don't do that for whatever reason. I don't understand. Everybody will have developers working in a particular time zone, right? We know that they will be working, let's say, if there is some overlap, maybe 12 hours a day, right? In two different regions, right? If they're all in one region, then it's going to be about 8 or 10 hours. They're not going to be likely working on a weekend. Most developers don't. And then that's going to be the case, right? But you keep those workloads running. You don't shut them down. And when you don't do that, you're paying for, you're using it for about 250 hours in a month, but paying for 750 hours. So a lot of times when we do work with the clients, we'll do these kind of basic things, right? Which is automate some of the non-production workloads, right? Shut down things which they're not using. The other part is scaling up and down, right? So these kind of things which you cannot do easily in a data center, but we can do this in cloud, right? I can get bunch of on-demand instances and scale your environment up if there is a spike. So we will do this kind of configurations. Obviously, that requires us to have the application needs to be built for us to be able to scale them horizontally. Obviously, so if they have a legacy SAP application running, we can't scale them horizontally. But if they have a custom app which has, let's say, OAuth-based JOT kind of authentication system, they have stateless backends. Sure, we can do that very easily. Right? It's just configuration. So these kind of things you have to make. Some hard decisions at the beginning, right? And the good thing when you do this kind of large projects is, for example, there have been cases where the application architecture that they had did not support horizontal scaling, right? Which meant they would reserve certain amount of workloads sitting in the data center. They'll try to repurpose it, but for most part of the year, it's not going to be used, right? There were so many such cases that we have encountered in past. What we will help them do is during this migration, we'll try and refactor their application so that we make the backend stateless. And once we have achieved the stateless, sometimes refactoring is minor, sometimes they're major. A lot of time it also requires upgrade in the application that they're using. But again, if there is a will by the organization that I'm going to have to do this, we are able to do that, and then that gives them the savings that they're looking for the cloud, right? But if you don't do that, then obviously, as I said, it's just renting from one place to the other, right? Then it's not going to result in a cost reduction. The second problem that we typically see is lack of visibility, right? As I said, in data center, not by design, but just the way they work, right? So most clients grow organically over a period of time. There's not the same level of diligence because it's not easy to track what are the things in the data center as well, right? If you're not following the proper change management processes, you will gonna have a sprawl. If you don't have the proper discovery and CMDB configured, there's going to be things that you don't know anything about, right? When you move to them to the cloud, now you have replicated the same situation, right? So part of the visibility and the traceability of the cloud is also becomes very important, which is why I said is one of the sort of foundation things that we do when we're migrating to cloud, and right. But once you have done that, or rather, if you're not doing it, then as I said, it's just the same thing over here again. You don't know what are the things that I can shut down, what are the things being used, what are the things that I can right size. All of the cloud treatments that we can apply, we don't know what to do because we simply have no information about what is running on those workloads. So that becomes the second very important aspect of what we do on the cloud itself, right? And then the other thing is it's very easy to sprawl on cloud, right? So if you don't have the right guardrails and right processes, what will end up happening is there's some developer there who has suddenly asked for a very large VM with a couple of terabytes of storage attached. Right? You're still tracking them. You have the right processes, but because you don't have a standardized way of working with your environment, there will be things like this happening, right? So your storage will grow over a period of time, things will keep getting added, and there is no control. So as I said, foundationally, what foundational problem is, there is a way or recommended way to operate in the cloud. If you don't do that, it's going to lead to these kind of situations, which will cause a cost overrun. Having said that, there are clients and organizations that we have worked with, which we know of, which we have helped them set it up, right, where they have managed to bring their cost down by anywhere between 30 to 40% as well, right, when they've moved to the cloud. And these are obviously best case scenarios, but even in the worst case, it is always possible to reduce cost by around 10-20% very easily. It's not that difficult, but it does require a bit of willpower, and it does require the right level of engagement from the client as well.
This was pretty insightful, like the 3 pointers of how do you do cloud migration. Rehan, when working across global clients and large delivery models, how do you balance standardization for scale with customization for business needs? And where does this usually fail?
See, where it fails is when a client, an organization or their partner tries to do a one size fits all kind of a solution, and that happens for many a reason, right? So for example, each partner will have their own way of working, right? For example, if you look at the way, and I'm not even talking about SIs like us, right? I'm talking about, let's say, cloud partners, right? Cloud hyperscalers. If you talk about how do I architect my network with Azure versus how do I architect my network with AWS, they have two different point of views. So there is there's a diversity in the way you can operate, which means each one of these will standardize on certain aspects, but then that aspect might not be the best way to operate given the client's context. So the first thing is, while standards are great and they should be the starting point, but it's not always that the standards will fit a particular organization, right? So when we work with any client or any organization, we will look at, great, we will bring all of the standards, the industry best practices, and the recommendations that is coming from the cloud partners as well. But then we have to tailor it based upon the context that the client has. And that context then varies based upon how they are organized, for that matter, right? So for example, some companies, they will have a centralized CIO who will have a almost like a foundational layer of compute, right? So they're going to have platform services, and they're just doing compute, right? It's part of the CIO, but this is like a small unit within the CIO, right, which does nothing but manages the platform, right? And then they productize everything within their ecosystem and have their larger IT teams consume them. Very different way of working compared to certain businesses where, although the consumption is managed centrally, but each business unit has its own way of working, right? And there are large conglomerates who operate like that, right? But very different way of working. So if I were to, let's say, come up with a standard which fits this way of working, which is platform services within a CIO, versus a organization which has a different way of working, which is independent squads and independent views, they will not be same. They will not work. So part of it is understanding that it is not going to be, you cannot do a one size fits all everybody to fit every organization. But again, as I said, the standards are important, right? Because it gives you speed, right? So if I come in with, let's say, my standard set of way of operations, I can just deploy them in a day or two, right? While if you develop everything from scratch, it's going to take a lot of time. So it gives you speed and predictability. It is tested and we know it works. But then just using that is not good enough, right? You have to have a compromise between standard and customizability, and that is what gives the best value to the organization eventually. So I mean, again, there are different ways of doing this, but typically what I would recommend to most organizations is just standardize on the platform part of it, right? Because even though regardless of how you operate, you can still standardize them, right? In terms of how do I deploy these services, right? How do I automate these services, right? So for example, if I have to provision a VM, the method of provisioning of the VM has to be same across, right? It doesn't matter if it is working in this way or that way. And then because I have a standardized way of provisioning, I can automate them across the organization, and then I can make this a lot more efficient for everybody. So the entire process, the life cycle of the workload becomes much more automated and much more efficient. While if you don't do that, obviously it becomes very difficult to manage because there will be di- different heterogeneous environment, and then managing this heterogeneous environment becomes a bit difficult. The other part of it, this is when you do these kind of things, you can have a centralized observability, right? You can have centralized security. Again, regardless of business units, typically the security controls will be same and the compliance controls the same. There will be one unit or the other which will have different variations depending upon geographies and other things. Right? So those are again the customization that we will have to do for those. But we'll build a standard sort of a baseline that look, this is where it has to be, and then based upon requirements of individuals, we will try and customize them a bit. But the foundation has to be strong and it has to be standard.
And now the last one is, and it's a pretty interesting one because it's close to your heart as well, is that you have seen, cloud journey evolve from hype to necessity. Where do you think AI is today on that curve? And what are the biggest misconception enterprises have right now?
So I see a lot of parallels, by the way, right, between the way AI is being adopted by the clients and the way cloud was initially adopted, or even perceived as by many organizations in the beginning. Part of it, for example, the magic wand still exists. So there is a thought process that I'm going to bring this AI and then magically it's going to do something. There's also the cost aspect, right, which was, as I said in the beginning, there was an expectation that because I'm going to do cloud, it should result in optimization of my costs, right? The same expectation is still there, right? Because I'm going to use AI, it should reduce my cost. The reality is, and having seen this for the last 3 years or so, the reality what we're seeing, and again, let me take that back, right? Uh, when we talk AI, the AI is a bit generic, right? Because we've had AI ML in the IT space for close to 8-10 years now, right? But when we say AI nowadays, we actually mean LLM and LLM adjacent systems. But when we talk about LLM adjacent systems, we don't have at this point use cases where um, you get direct cost reductions, right, or large cost reductions. So I'm going to give you some examples. So for example, look at the BPO industry, right, where they're usually ahead of the curve when in trying to adopt AI, right? BPO and customer support, IT help desk, and those kind of industries. They've had NLP-based voice bots for close to 12 years. I myself have done some demos for many clients where we, did a demo of the help desk, right? You call up someone and you speak to, they will fix your problem in the laptop. Once it was over, we used to tell them, look, this was a bot that you spoke to, right? It is not a person. And it used to be a pretty good user experience, right? It wasn't that it was bad. Right. So those have existed for a while. There has been statistical models which is used to diagnose predictively if something is going to fail. Those have existed since 2016, around 2016. ServiceNow was one of the pioneers. There are others who have done a lot of work in and around this space. Right now, what I'm seeing in the market at this point, and again, another thing is use of OCR and similar kind of tools in the backend processing. Right? Those have existed, and there are very mature workflows which automate part of the entire business process workflow that is there for many clients or many organizations. The tendency nowadays, what I'm seeing is many organizations think that I'm going to get rid of these, or they're not even aware of them, or they're not well aware of them, and they'll say, you know what, I'm going to use AI to solve customer support. Right. Now, the point of the matter is, yes, there is value in using AI or LLM based models in doing customer support, right? But that is not a cost reduction, necessarily not a cost reduction, because you have to understand, right? For a customer support call, that typically it will cost like $6, for a 10, 15 minutes, 10, 15 minutes engagement or 10, 15 minutes discussion or a support call. Right? That basically sets a threshold. Right? LLM consumption cannot be more than that, because if it is more than that, then there is no business case. Right? It is in the ballpark. Right? So depending upon the length of the conversation, it will go either way. Right? But that is not where the value is. It's not about cost reduction. It's about being able to speak to a person in the language and the dialect that they're comfortable with, in the accent that they're comfortable with. Right? That is where the value is. So you improve user experience. It's a question of bettering the capabilities and bettering the experience that your users have. A question of reduction of cost. Right? Not always.
Right.
Similarly, as I was giving you the example of the IT outsourcing world, right? So in the observability space, for example, is a good example. There, in the recent past, there has been more than one organization where I've worked with them to try and figure out a LLM based solution to rapid troubleshooting and resolutions. The consistent theme that I'm seeing at this point is, if I were to, let's say, you have to understand, right? So it's not a standalone. It's not going to be like 100 people supporting 2,000 workloads. It's never that. The 100 people or people, whatever those are, they are armed with proper tools. And I'm talking about they will have tools that is able to do discovery of the environment. They will build network topologies. They will have predictive methods of figuring out what's going wrong and where is it going wrong. Right? They will have correlation and duplication engines in there. Right? So there's a lot of features that are already there, which are rules based, which are very deterministic, right? And which are a lot more cost effective. With LLMs, the problem arises is, so one of the examples that I can give you is an organization that I'm working with. They want to build their own sort of a support agent where you feed all kinds of logs, right? And those logs are then analyzed together, and it helps rapid troubleshooting and figure out basically if there are health deterioration markers and such. Right? What we have demonstrated to them that this will not result in a cost reduction, because when you ingest gigabytes of logs, all of those is going to cost you money, and you have to convert them into tokens, and tokens then cost you money. So it's not a matter of thought, but where it makes a difference is your MTTR, which used to be 3 hours 50 minutes, that is down to 1 hour, because you're able to pinpoint exact problem before an engineer gets to it and starts looking at it, right? So there is a method that the industry is adopting or sort of building towards, where the LLMs and the agents work together. When I say agents, I mean LLM agents and the people work together, and they build. It's not still not deterministic, right? But it is almost deterministic workflow where the human is in the control and they're taking decisions still. While there exists a subset of tools and companies with promise of fully automated AI agents who manage everything in your environment, the hard reality is I've seen that in one or two places, and it is a bit problematic, right? Because these are not deterministic systems, and when they are not deterministic, you don't know what they're going to do, and our regulations are not set up to deal with that. So, for example, if your LLM for whatever reason leaks some private PII data, GDPR does not care, right? GDPR is going to hit you with fine. If you give an LLM the ability to go and do admin things, they will do these kind of admin things, right? No matter how many rules you put in, at the end of the day, it is a LLM which is trying to take a probabilistic guess on what is it that I should be doing next. Right? So it gets a bit tricky, but the model that it eventually looks like it's moving towards is, as I said, a human in the loop kind of a model where a human takes most of the decisions, right? Which itself is a bit interesting, and we're going to see the repercussions in the Indian market as well, which is because these agents are doing work which we would expect typically level 1, level 2 engineers to do. The bar is going to be raised, right? And I'm talking both operations and development, right? Because LLM can code better than a graduate college student at this point. So the bar is going to have to be raised by the education system in India as well, right? Because all of us who have been around for a while and understand this, right? So when Infi CEO and the CEOs of Wipros and others say that the college graduates are not employable, this is what it means, right? Because you can't take them and put them in front of production system. But more and more what we're seeing is LLMs which are fine-tuned for specific purposes are good enough for us to be able to put them in a production system, at least in certain context with some guidance. So it is going to result in a scenario where we will see there's going to be impact, obviously, but I also see that because of this becoming a bit easier to develop, right? So for example, with think of it this way, right? You have unlimited number of 2 year or unlimited number of software engineers with 2 years of experience. You can develop anything you want, and at a very rapid pace, right? No longer you have to wait for a month's time for them to get trained and understand what's happening. They will do that instantly, right? So it also means we will see more and more software being used in the market, which also means then once the bar has been or the gap has been reduced, there will be more jobs that will be get created, right? But it's going to be a near-term impact. I'm absolutely sure about that. So we are seeing a lot of these things again, right? So it's similar to, for example, in 2012, we used to hear, the cloud is coming and is going to get rid of the entire outsourcing. Everything's going to get in cloud. What happened was really that, not really, right? So cloud sort of played a factor or one of the key drivers in the growth of the IT industry overall, right? And also in terms of giving the flexibility and the ability to clients to do things much faster. Most of these patterns are being repeated, is what I'm seeing at this point.
This was pretty insightful, Rian, and thank you for the last couple of minutes where you basically also bust this myth that AI is gonna take away a lot of jobs and then freshers will be unemployed. The need is to raise the bar, and
Yes.
also the human in the loop thing which you talked about.
Investigation is going to be to understand how this will work, right? So you have investigations being done by agent. You have resolutions also which could possibly be done by agent, right? You just have to double check them. But for you to be able to do that, you need to understand what's happening, right? So then what that means is you have to understand advanced concepts in how does a cloud system operate, right? How does a application operate? So it's no longer enough for you to just learn a programming language, right? Because LLMs can do programming languages better than you can, or they can do scripting better than anybody coming out of college can. But you have to have a higher bar where you come in almost, I would say, you have to have experience that typically people with 3-4 years of industry experience have, right? The college has to become a lot more focused on developing practical skills rather than going through these kind of exercises where you just learn, what's the pointer and what do I do with a pointer. Useful. I'm not saying they're not useful, but again, LLM can write pointers better than any of us can, right? So
Yes. Thank you so much, Rehan, for sharing all these insights and very insightful conversation. I would also request all the colleges to make sure that this podcast reaches each and every student of your college, so that they can learn a lot of things here and also will be very much beneficial to all the leaders who are operating in cloud, AI, and related space. And thank you again, Rehan, for taking out time and sharing all these insights. We look forward to hosting you again, sir, maybe on a different set of topics.